Officer David Miller adjusted the brim of his patrol cap, the morning sun barely cresting the rooftops of Oakwood Drive. Beside him, in the passenger seat of the cruiser, his K9 partner, Rex, let out a soft, contented sigh, his intelligent brown eyes scanning the familiar suburban landscape. It was a picture of tranquility, the kind of quiet Tuesday that made David appreciate the slower pace of Oakwood. A stark contrast to the gritty urban sprawl of the city he'd transferred from years ago. David had found his anchor in this peaceful town. And in Rex. The German Shepherd wasn't just a partner, he was a steadfast companion, a silent confidant who understood the unspoken language of shared duty and quiet camaraderie. Rex had seen David through tough calls and long nights, his unwavering loyalty a constant comfort. David, in turn, dedicated himself to Rex's well-being, ensuring the powerful dog was always in peak condition, both physically and mentally. Their bond was something deeper than just handler and K9. It was a testament to the quiet understanding between two beings dedicated to serving and protecting. Today, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming honeysuckle. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a distant playground. It was the kind of morning that lulled one into a sense of security. A deceptive calm that David, with his years of experience, knew could be shattered in an instant. He always kept an ear tuned to the police scanner, a watchful eye on every shadow, every slightly ajar gate. It was second nature, a quiet hum beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. Their patrol route took them past the edge of the old Albright estate, a sprawling, Gothic revival mansion that had always been a source of local whispers. Set back from the road behind a high, crumbling stone wall and dense, overgrown rhododendrons, it was a relic of a bygone era, its dark windows staring out like vacant eyes. Mrs. Albright, the mansion's sole occupant, was a recluse, a shadowy figure rarely seen outside her property. Locals spun tales of her eccentricities, her reclusive nature, and the mysterious disappearance of her son decades ago, a tragedy that seemed to shroud the entire estate in a veil of perpetual sorrow. David usually gave the place a wide berth, respecting the owner's desire for privacy, and, frankly, finding nothing but an eerie silence emanating from its grounds. But today was different. As they rounded the bend, the morning sun, now higher in the sky, caught something. A glint, a sudden, sharp flash from an upstairs window of the mansion. Barely perceptible. Gone almost as soon as it appeared. David's eyes, trained to spot the minutiae, caught it. He frowned, his brow furrowing slightly. It was too deliberate to be a random reflection, too rhythmic to be a trick of the light. He slowed the cruiser, his gaze fixed on the window. Nothing. Just the dusty, opaque glass reflecting the sky. He was about to dismiss it as an optical illusion, a momentary lapse in his typically sharp observation. When it happened again, flash, 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 David's breath hitched. His mind, honed by years of training and a childhood fascination with codes, immediately recognized the pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. S.O.S. A universal cry for help, a desperate signal. His heart, usually a steady drumbeat, began to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was unmistakable. Someone, likely trapped within that imposing, silent house, was sending a distress signal. Beside him, Rex, who had been lazily observing a squirrel scamper up an oak tree, suddenly stiffened. His ears, usually flopped gently, snapped upright, rotating towards the mansion. A low, guttural whine rumbled in his chest. A sound David knew well. It was Rex's signal for unease, for something profoundly wrong. The hairs along the K9's spine bristled, and he began to sniff the air. A deep, restless inhale, as if trying to pull understanding from the very molecules. "What is it, boy?" David murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Though he knew, Rex's agitation only confirmed his terrifying suspicion. David immediately pulled the cruiser over to the side of the road, the tires crunching softly on the gravel shoulder. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. His gaze remained locked on that window, a silent demand for further confirmation. And then, for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, he saw it. A small, pale face pressed against the dusty paint, framed by the dark interior. A child's face. Wide, desperate eyes, brimming with a silent plea. Before David could even fully process the image, it vanished, as if the very air had swallowed it. The window returned to its opaque, unrevealing state, reflecting only the indifferent sky. The mansion, which moments before had merely been an old, reclusive landmark, now loomed with a sinister aura. Its silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, pregnant with untold secrets. A child, trapped, sending an S.O.S signal. David felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to get inside, to find that child. This wasn't just a routine patrol anymore. This was a silent, desperate call for rescue. And Officer David Miller, with Rex by his side, knew he couldn't ignore it. The piece of Oakwood Drive had just been irrevocably shattered. The silent plea from the window had ignited a fuse within David. These set words etched into his mind with the chilling clarity of a death knell, reverberated with a desperate urgency that transcended the quiet suburban morning. It wasn't just a series of blinks. It was a scream without a sound, a cry for help that had found its way to him. And the fleeting glimpse of that terrified child's face, pale, wide-eyed, desperate, was a punch to the gut. It pulled at a forgotten ache within him, a memory of his own childhood, of times when he, too, had felt trapped and unheard. "Rex!" "Stay!" David commanded, his voice tight with purpose. Rex, sensing the shift in his partner, sat obediently but remained tense, a low, continuous rumble in his chest. His gaze, fixed on the looming mansion, mirrored David's own apprehension. David stepped out of the cruiser, the gravel crunching under his boots, a stark sound in the oppressive silence. He walked with a determined stride toward the imposing iron gates of the Albright estate. They were a testament to another era, wrought from dark, twisted metal, adorned with rusted, sharp spikes that seemed to warn away any unwelcome intrusion. The gate, even in its dilapidated state, felt like a formidable barrier, a physical representation of the isolation within. He reached for the cold, ornate intercom box beside the gate. His finger hovered over the call button for a moment, his mind racing. What would he say? How would he explain this? A child just flashed an S.O.S at me. It sounded insane, the stuff of thrillers. Not real life in a town like Oakwood. Yet, the desperate eyes of that child were real, as real as the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. He pressed the button. A faint, distant buzzing sound echoed from somewhere within the mansion, followed by a crackle from the intercom speaker. Yes, a voice, sharp and brittle, cut through the static. It was Mrs. Albright, even through the distorted speaker. Her tone was cold, dismissive, laced with an unmistakable air of annoyance. "Good morning, Mrs. Albright. This is Officer Miller. Oakwood PD," David began, striving for a calm, professional demeanor that belied the turmoil churning inside him. "I was just patrolling the area and noticed, well, I received a visual signal from an upstairs window of your residence. It appeared to be a distress signal. There was a beat of silence on the other end, long and chilling. David could almost feel the frost emanating from her. Then, her voice, devoid of warmth. returned. A distress signal, officer. I'm afraid you must be mistaken. There is no one else here, and certainly no distress. Her words were clipped, precise, each syllable dripping with an icy finality. Mrs. Albright, I specifically observed an S.O.S. signal, and I saw a child's face at the window. David pressed, his patience wearing thin. I need to ensure everyone inside is safe. Another silence. This one was even heavier, more loaded, when she spoke again. Her voice had hardened, becoming a low, dangerous growl. Officer, I assure you, you are mistaken. I am a solitary woman. I live alone. There are no children here, and I certainly do not appreciate baseless accusations or intrusions on my privacy. She paused, then added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but one that carried an undeniable threat. This is a private residence. I must ask you to leave immediately. If you persist, I will consider it harassment and report you. The line went dead. The click was abrupt. A digital slam of the door. David stared at the intercom, his jaw tight, his hand clenched into a fist at his side. The audacity, the sheer dismissiveness in her voice, infuriated him. How could she be so calm, so utterly unconcerned? When a child had just flashed a desperate signal from her house, behind him, Rex let out a frustrated whine, then began to bark, a deep, resonant sound that bounced off the mansion walls. The K9 pushed himself against the cruiser door, clearly agitated, his powerful body vibrating with an almost frantic energy. He was barking not with aggression, but with a deep, guttural plea, as if he, too, felt the desperate urgency David felt. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, his keen senses picking up on something David couldn't articulate. Rex's agitation confirmed every terrifying suspicion David had. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong. David turned back to the gate, his eyes sweeping over the dark, unwelcoming facade of the mansion. The silence that had once seemed merely reclusive now felt like a suffocating shroud, concealing something unspeakable. Mrs. Albright's words, "There are no children here," rang hollow. A blatant lie. He had seen the boy. He had seen the S.O.S. He knew he couldn't just leave. Not now. Not when a child's life might be hanging in the balance. The image of that pale, terrified face burned in his mind, a silent accusation. He wouldn't abandon him. He walked slowly back to the cruiser, Rex still whining and pawing at the window. He opened the back door to calm the agitated K9 stroking Rex's head, feeling the powerful muscles tremble beneath his hand. "It's okay. Boy, we're not leaving," David murmured, his voice firm, a promise to himself as much as to Rex. He knew what he had to do next. He had to report this. Officially, but he also knew, deep down, that the system might not move fast enough, might not believe him without more concrete evidence. A single S.O.S. from a known recluse's house, with no other corroborating evidence, could easily be dismissed as a hallucination or a misinterpretation, but David knew what he saw, and Rex knew what he sensed. The air around the mansion was thick with unspoken secrets, and David was determined to unearth them. No matter the obstacles, the quiet, idyllic facade of Oakwood Drive had been shattered, revealing a chilling darkness beneath. And David Miller, with his loyal K9 partner, was ready to face it head-on, back in the relative safety of his cruiser. David tried to rationalize, to find any logical explanation for what he had witnessed. Something that didn't involve a child being held against their will, but the image of that small, terrified face, the desperate S.O.S., and Rex's frantic reaction stubbornly refused to be dismissed. They clung to him like burrs, digging in deeper with every passing second. He knew protocol. The next step was to report the incident to his supervisor, Sergeant Davies. David picked up his radio, his fingers tightening around the mice. Unit 305 to dispatch. Requesting to speak with Sergeant Davies. Go ahead. 305, Sergeant Davies is on line 1, came the crackle of the dispatcher's voice. David switched channel. Sergeant, this is Miller. I need to report a unusual incident. He recounted the events concisely, focusing on the objective facts that S.O.S signal, the glimpse of the child, Rex's agitation, and Mrs. Albright's icy denial and refusal to cooperate. He kept his tone professional, devoid of the emotion churning inside him. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then, Sergeant Davies' voice, deep and measured, came through. Miller, you know Mrs. Albright, she's particular eccentric. Yes, but never been any trouble. You're sure about this? So it's an old place. Lots of glare, reflections. Sergeant, I am positive. David interrupted, his voice firm. I saw the pattern, and I saw a child. Rex's reaction was unmistakable. He was highly agitated, barking at the gate, trying to get to that locked-up house. He deliberately emphasized Rex's role. Knowing the K-9's instincts were highly respected within the department, a sigh filtered through the radio. Look, Miller, I appreciate your vigilance, but we can't just go kicking down doors based on a flicker of light and a glimpse of what might have been a child. Mrs. Albright has a reputation. She's well connected. A baseless accusation of child endangerment could land us in a heap of trouble. It's her word against a series of blinks. David felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew this would be the response. Sergeant, with all due respect, what if I'm right? What if there's a child in there, in danger? Then we'll address it. Miller. But we need more concrete evidence. Right now. All you have is a gut feeling and a light signal that could be anything. For now. I'm advising caution. Log the incident, but let's not escalate. Keep an eye on the place if you want, but without a warrant or further evidence. We can't do much more. The line clicked. Dismissal, just as David had feared. He leaned back in his seat, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. The sun, once a harbinger of a peaceful day, now seemed to mock him, highlighting the impenetrable facade of the mansion. He looked at Rex, who had finally settled, but whose eyes still darted anxiously towards the ominous estate. He doesn't believe me. Boy, David murmured, his voice heavy with frustration. Rex responded with a soft nudge of his wet nose against David's arm, a silent offering of comfort and understanding, the sergeant's words. Lack of concrete evidence echoed in his mind, but the image of that small, desperate face was more concrete than any piece of paper. David had grown up in a fractured home, navigating the silent cruelties of neglect and emotional abuse. He remembered the feeling of being invisible, of wishing someone, anyone, would see his silent pleas, his own S.O.S that no one ever recognized. He remembered the burning shame, the desperate hope that flickered and died with each passing day. He had become a police officer precisely because of that past. He wanted to be the one who saw, who heard, who intervened. He wanted to be the hero he never had. And now, faced with a child clearly in distress, he was being told to stand down. A quiet rage began to simmer within him, mixing with a fierce determination. He wouldn't abandon this child. He couldn't. Not when he had seen the signal, felt the raw desperation. The system might be slow, might demand warrants and irrefutable proof, but his conscience demanded immediate action. He knew he couldn't go storming the mansion. That would be reckless. Jeopardize his career and potentially harm the very child he was trying to save. He needed a way in, a loophole, a legitimate reason to return to the Albright estate and demand entry. David thought about Mrs. Albright. Her reclusiveness was legendary. Her wealth and influence were equally well known. People didn't cross her in Oakwood, but what about the rumors the local gossip David had always dismissed as idle chatter now took on a new, chilling significance? The whispers of a hidden child or an adopted orphan that occasionally surfaced when Mrs. Albright's name came up. He'd always assumed they were malicious inventions. But what if they held a kernel of truth? What if the tragedy of her lost son had led her down a path of misguided, even dangerous, obsession? He started the cruiser, pulling away from the curb but not leaving the area entirely. He drove around the block, slowly, thoughtfully, his eyes scanning every inch of the Albright property perimeter. The high walls, the dense foliage, the lack of any visible play equipment or signs of a child's presence. It was all meticulously hidden. Too meticulously. His mind began to race. Sifting through police procedure manuals, legal precedents, anything that could give him leverage, there had to be something. A welfare check. That was it. A welfare check. If there was reasonable suspicion, but what constituted reasonable suspicion beyond his own gut feeling and a fleeting glimpse? He needed to find something. Anything. To bolster his case. Something that would stand up in court. Something that even Sergeant Davies couldn't dismiss. He needed to dig deeply into Mrs. Albright's past, into the history of the mansion, into the very fabric of this seemingly tranquil town that harbored such a dark secret. He made a silent vow to the boy. "I'm coming back for you, I promise." Rex, sensing his partner's renewed resolve, let out a soft whine, then settled. His intelligent eyes fixed on David, a silent reassurance that they were in this together. The fight for justice, for one small, desperate child, had just begun. Desperate. The dismissal from Sergeant Davies chafed at David. It wasn't just a professional setback, it was a moral one. He was an officer of the law, sworn to protect, and he felt utterly constrained by the very system he represented. The phrase lack of concrete evidence echoed in his mind. A cold, clinical barrier between him and the terrified child he'd seen. He spent the rest of his shift in a state of simmering frustration, his eyes constantly drawn to the Albright estate, a dark blot on the otherwise serene landscape. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves seemed to mock him, whispering of the hidden despair within. Rex, usually dozing peacefully during patrol, remained unusually alert, his head occasionally lifting, a low rumble vibrating in his chest when they passed the mansion. His canine partner, often a mirror of David's own emotional state, was a constant, tangible reminder that this wasn't some figment of his imagination as soon as his shift ended. David bypassed his usual routine of heading straight home. Instead, he drove to the Oakwood Public Library, a quaint brick building nestled among century-old oak trees. The librarian, a kindly woman named Martha who knew David from his occasional visits with Rex, offered a warm smile. "Evening. Officer Miller, researching something interesting," she asked, gesturing to the rows of dusty tomes. "Something like that." "Martha," David replied, a grim set to his jaw. He headed straight for the local history archives, a section often overlooked by most patrons. He needed to dig, to unearth anything that might shed light on Mrs. Albright, on the mansion, on anything that could give him the leverage he desperately needed. He started with old newspaper microfiches, scrolling through decades of local headlines. It wasn't long before he found the first chilling piece of the puzzle, a grainy black and white photo. Dated nearly 30 years ago, local heiress's son disappears. The article detailed the baffling vanishing of Mrs. Albright's only son, Arthur. Then a teenager. No trace. No ransom note. Just a void. The case had gone cold, leaving a heartbroken mother and a town shrouded in speculation. This, David realized, explained Mrs. Albright's reclusiveness, her bitter demeanor. but it didn't explain the child. He kept scrolling, cross-referencing names and dates, and then he found it, a series of smaller articles, buried deeper in the archives, dating back about 10 years. They were whispers, really, not front-page news. Rumors persist about Albright Mansion's secret child. The article spoke of fleeting sightings by delivery drivers, fleeting sounds heard by neighbors like the child's cry, a shadowy figure at a window, but each time, Mrs. Albright vehemently denied the claims, threatening legal action, and the whispers would die down, smothered by her influence and the lack of concrete proof. One article, in particular, caught David's eye. It detailed a brief, inconclusive investigation by Child Protective Services almost a decade prior, triggered by an anonymous tip. The report was vague, stating insufficient evidence to proceed with a welfare check without owner consent. Mrs. Albright, even then, had been uncooperative. Denying access to her property, the case was closed, filed away, another unsolved mystery buried under Oakwood's veneer of respectability. David felt a surge of cold anger. This wasn't a new phenomenon. People had suspected, had even tried to intervene. But Mrs. Albright's iron will and the lack of overt proof had always prevailed. The system, designed to protect, had failed before. He refused to let it fail again. He then shifted his focus, moving to legal texts and obscure government documents. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew enough about the law to look for unconventional avenues. He pored over property laws, welfare codes, and emergency statutes. Hours blurred into a singular, focused mission. The library lights dimmed around him, and Martha eventually had to remind him it was closing time. "Found anything useful, officer?" she asked kindly, noting the intensity in his eyes. "Maybe." "Martha." "Maybe," David replied, a faint spark of grim hope in his voice. He had found a forgotten piece of legislation, an archaic property law that, under very specific circumstances, allowed for a limited welfare check on a private residence if there was reasonable and articulable suspicion of neglect, endangerment, or dire living conditions of a minor within, and immediate access is denied. The key was articulable suspicion, his S.O.S signal. Combined with Rex's unwavering distress and the historical whispers about a hidden child, might just be enough. It wasn't a full-blown search warrant, but it was a foot in the door. He knew he couldn't go back to Sergeant Davies with this. He needed someone else, someone with the authority to initiate a welfare check without needing to be convinced that a series of blinks constituted a bona fide emergency. He thought of Ms. Reynolds, a social worker he'd encountered on a previous case involving child neglect. She was sharp, tenacious, and fiercely dedicated to protecting children. She wasn't afraid to push boundaries when necessary, as long as the law allowed it. More importantly, she believed in the power of intuition, especially when backed by a K9's instinct. He left the library, the cool night air doing little to extinguish the fire that now burned within him. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time since he'd seen that S.O.S, David felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this. He had Rex. And now, he had the makings of a plan. He would approach Miss Reynolds first thing in the morning. Together, they would navigate the bureaucratic maze and get that child out of the Albright mansion. He wouldn't rest until justice was served and that boy was safe. The first rays of dawn were just piercing the horizon when David pulled into the parking lot of the Oakwood Department of Social Services. He hadn't slept much. The image of Ethan's desperate face haunting his thoughts. Rex, sensing David's unwavering resolve, lay quietly in the back seat, a steadfast presence. David had called Miss Reynolds' office voicemail late last night, leaving a terse but urgent message. He knew she started early, a dedication that mirrored his own. He was counting on her. He found her at her desk, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. A stack of folders already piled high. Ms. Sarah Reynolds was a woman in her late 40s, with kind, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her sandy blonde hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore a sensible, but not unfashionable, pantsuit. She looked up as David approached, a slight frown creasing her brow. "Officer Miller, your message sounded urgent." "What's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but alert. David wasted no time. He pulled up a chair and laid out the entire story, from the moment he saw the S.O.S signal, to the fleeting glimpse of the boy, Mrs. Albright's chilling denial, Sergeant Davis' dismissal, and finally, his late-night research into the obscure property law and the past rumors surrounding the Albright mansion. He spoke with a quiet intensity, his conviction unwavering, and Rex was agitated. "Profoundly so," David added, gesturing towards the cruiser visible through the office window. "He's never reacted like that unless there's genuine distress. It's more than a gut feeling, Miss Reynolds. It's an undeniable alarm bell. Miss..." Reynolds listened intently, her expression unreadable. She occasionally nodded, or made a brief note on a pad. When David finished, a silence hung in the air, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Mrs. Albright," she mused, more to herself than to David. "Yes, I remember the file from a decade ago. Anonymous tip. Insufficient evidence. It always bothered me. A wealthy, reclusive woman, a whispered secret, and nothing ever came of it." She picked up a pen and tapped it thoughtfully against her lip. An S.O.S. signal. A child's face. "Officer Miller. This is serious. And this old law you found, it's obscure, but it could be exactly what we need." She looked at David, her kind eyes now filled with a focused determination. "You're right to come to me. Sergeant Davies, bless his heart, is a good man, but he's too much by the book for something like this. This requires a different approach, one that leans on intuition and legal technicality rather than immediate, overt proof." She stood up, her movements decisive. "All right, here's what we'll do. I'll draft the formal request for a welfare check. Citing the specific statute you found, we'll emphasize the visible distress signal, the confirmed K9 agitation, and the historical context of prior unsubstantiated concerns. Those old rumors and the previous CPS investigation. It builds a pattern of reasonable suspicion. It won't be a search warrant, but it will be a demand for access for a welfare check on a minor." "Will she let us in?" David asked, remembering Mrs. Albright's icy threat. Mr. Reynolds gave a wry smile. "She won't have a choice, not legally. She can deny a search warrant without cause. But a welfare check, with enough articulable suspicion, is different. If she refuses, we can involve a judge to issue an immediate order, or even consider a forced entry if we have reason to believe the child is in imminent danger. We go in, we state our purpose, and we don't leave until we've seen every corner of that house where a child could be." A wave of relief washed over David, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He hadn't realized how much tension he'd been carrying until it began to release. "Thank you. Ms. Reynolds, thank you. Don't thank me yet. Officer, this is just the first step," she said, already typing rapidly on her computer. "This woman is formidable. She won't make it easy, but a child's safety is paramount." Within an hour, the paperwork was complete. Miss Ada Reynolds printed out the documents, her signature bold and clear at the bottom. "Ready, Officer Miller." "Let's go get that boy." They drove to the Albright estate in Miss Reynolds' unmarked car, with David's cruiser and Rex following close behind. The air felt charged, a palpable sense of anticipation hanging between them. As they approached the familiar iron gates, David felt a surge of nervous energy. This was it. the confrontation he knew was coming. The mansion looked even more formidable in the harsh morning light. Its windows, dark and uninviting, seemed to stare back with an ancient, knowing gaze. Rex, in the cruiser behind them, began to whine softly, a low, anxious sound that grew more insistent as they pulled to a stop. Miss Reynolds pressed the intercom button. The familiar crackle filled the air. Yes, Mrs. Albright's voice, sharp as ever, cut through. Mrs. Albright, this is Sarah Reynolds from Social Services, accompanied by Officer Miller of the Oakwood Police Department. Miss Reynolds stated, her voice clear and authoritative, devoid of any weakness. We are here to conduct a welfare check on a minor residing on the premises. We have sufficient grounds under State Statute 42B, subsection C, to request immediate access. A long, chilling silence followed. David could almost hear Mrs. Albright's mind working, calculating. He knew she recognized Ms. Reynolds' name, and the mention of the specific statute would tell her this wasn't a casual visit. Then, her voice, laced with a barely concealed fury, returned. This is an outrage. I told Officer Miller there is no child here. This is harassment. You have no right, Mrs. Albright. We have received a distress signal and have reason to believe a minor's welfare may be at risk. Miss Reynolds calmly countered, her voice unwavering. If you refuse us entry, we will be forced to seek an immediate court order for access, which will escalate this matter significantly. It is in your best interest to cooperate. Another tense silence. David's heart hammered against his ribs. He could feel Rex's increasing agitation behind them, a frantic whimpering and scratching against the cruiser window. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Albright's voice, now tinged with reluctant defeat, came through the intercom. Very well, but know this. You will find nothing, and you will regret this intrusion. The heavy iron gates, with a slow, grinding groan, began to swing inward, revealing the long, overgrown driveway leading to the dark, imposing mansion. David felt a rush of adrenaline. The fight was far from over, but the first formidable barrier had fallen. The boy's silent seal wind had finally opened the door. The iron gates groaned open, revealing a driveway choked with weeds, leading to a mansion that seemed to absorb the very light of the morning. It was an unsettling sight, one that amplified David's apprehension. Ms. Reynolds, ever composed, pulled her car slowly forward, with David following in his cruiser, Rex whimpering softly in the back, his anxiety palpable. The mansion's imposing facade, with its dark, recessed windows and crumbling gargoyles, loomed larger as they approached. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something stagnant. A faint undercurrent of decay that hinted at secrets long buried. They parked near the grand, imposing front door, a heavy oak monstrosity with ornate carvings that seemed to twist into grotesque faces in the dim light. As David and Miss Reynolds exited their vehicles, Rex's whimpering escalated into a low, mournful howl. He scrabbled at the cruiser door, his powerful body trembling, his eyes fixed on the house with an intensity that sent shivers down David's spine. Rex, David murmured, trying to calm him. But the K-9 was beyond normal commands. His instincts were screaming, confirming every one of David's fears, before they could even reach the porch. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Albright. She stood framed in the doorway, a slender woman with a severe, almost skeletal frame. Her silver hair was pulled back tightly, emphasizing sharp cheekbones and eyes that were like chips of glacial ice cold, unyielding, and filled with a simmering resentment. She wore a dark, ankle-length dress that seemed to absorb all color, making her appear like a phantom against the gloomy interior of the mansion. Come in, then, she said, her voice a thin, brittle thread of sound, laced with open contempt. "Since you insist on this ridiculous intrusion." She didn't step aside fully, forcing them to squeeze past her into the cavernous entrance hall. The interior of the mansion was as grim as its exterior. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. The air was heavy, stale, smelling of old wood, disuse, and something vaguely metallic. Heavy velvet drapes, faded and tattered, hung at the windows, blocking out most of the natural light. The furniture was draped in white sheets, giving the vast rooms a ghostly appearance, like a tomb. As I told Officer Miller, "You will find no child here," Mrs. Albright stated, her voice echoing in the vast, silent space. She walked ahead of them with a stiff, almost regal posture, leading them through a formal drawing room filled with shrouded antiques. "I live alone, always have. These absurd accusations are nothing more than a desperate attempt to harass an elderly woman." Mrs. Reynolds remained impassive. "Mrs. Albright, we are here solely to conduct a welfare check for a minor. We have received information that gives us reasonable cause for concern. We will need to see all areas of the house where a child could potentially be present." Her voice was calm, professional, cutting through Mrs. Albright's bluster. Mrs. Albright scoffed. "And where exactly do you imagine I keep this phantom child in the ballroom? The library, feel free to look. You'll find only dust and the ghost of the past." She gestured vaguely towards the vast, silent rooms. As they began their search, a strange, eerie quiet settled over the house. Every step echoed loudly on the polished wooden floors. David kept his senses heightened, his eyes sweeping every corner, every shadow. He noticed the meticulously maintained, yet lifeless, quality of the house. There were no personal effects, no family photos, no signs of warmth or life, certainly nothing that suggested a child's presence. It was as if time had stopped here decades ago. Leaving behind only the husks of forgotten lives, they moved from the formal living areas to the kitchen, which was surprisingly modern but spotless, almost surgically clean, as if rarely used. Then to the dining room, equally pristine and unwelcoming. Rex, who David had brought inside, was their silent, furry compass. He moved with a restless energy, sniffing, whining, his tail low but his entire body tense. He'd occasionally stop, nose to the floor, let out a soft whine, then move on, as if searching for a scent that was tantalizingly close but too faint to pinpoint. "You see," Mrs. Albright said, a sneer on her thin lips. "Nothing, just as I said." But Rex's behavior told a different story. He led them through a maze of echoing hallways, past forgotten portrait galleries and dusty studies. His agitation grew with every step they took deeper into the mansion's labyrinthine layout. He seemed drawn to the older, more neglected parts of the house, where the air grew even colder, the dust thicker. They eventually reached a less used wing of the mansion, tucked away behind a servant's staircase. Here, the temperature dropped noticeably. The air was heavy, stagnant, imbued with a strange, metallic odor that David couldn't quite place. Rex suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He stood rigid, his head cocked, his powerful nose twitching. A low, persistent growl vibrated from his chest, deeper and more menacing than before. He was staring at a heavy wooden door, set into a recessed archway. The door itself was old, with ornate rusted hinges and a tarnished brass doorknob. "What is this room?" Miss Reynolds asked, her voice calm but her eyes narrowing. Mrs. Albright's composure, which had been so unwavering, suddenly fractured, a flicker of panic, quick as a hummingbird's wing, crossed her face, immediately replaced by a mask of stubborn defiance. "That is merely a storage room," she stated, her voice unnaturally strained. There is nothing of interest in there. It's locked for a reason. Family heirlooms, not for viewing. But Rex wasn't listening. He began to paw frantically at the door, his growls escalating into urgent barks. He scratched at the old wood, leaving faint but visible marks, then let out a sharp, piercing whine, a sound of profound distress. His body was quivering, vibrating with a desperate urgency that was impossible to ignore. David noticed. 2. Faint, almost imperceptible scratch marks already etched into the lower part of the doorframe. Almost as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. Storage. David's voice was low, dangerous. Rex doesn't react like this to dusty heirlooms. Mrs. Albright, he's reacting to life, to distress. What's in there? Mrs. Reynolds stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. Mrs. Albright, if it's merely storage, there should be no issue opening it. We require access to all enclosed spaces where a minor could reasonably be concealed. Her gaze was unwavering, piercing through Mrs. Albright's facade. Your K-9 partner's reaction, Officer Miller, is undeniable. This is more than suspicion now. This is a clear indication. Mrs. Albright's eyes darted frantically between David, Miss Reynolds, and the furiously barking Rex. Her face, usually so composed, was contorting with a mixture of fear and rage. She knew she was losing control. The dam was about to break. You have no right, she shrieked, her voice suddenly high-pitched, echoing through the silent mansion. You will not open that door, I forbid it. But the desperate sound of Rex's barks and whines, combined with the faint scratch marks on the door, had already sealed her fate. David and Miss Reynolds exchanged a look. There was no doubt left. Whatever was behind that door, it was not merely storage, and they were about to find out exactly what secret Mrs. Albright had been so desperately trying to hide. The truth was about to be unsealed, and David knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would not be a pleasant revelation. Mrs. Albright's shriek echoed through the cavernous hall, a desperate animalistic sound that reverberated off the high ceilings. You will not. You cannot. This is private property. I will call my lawyers. I will have your badges. Her voice cracked, revealing the sheer terror bubbling beneath her carefully constructed facade. But her protests were futile against the combined resolve of David Miller and Sarah Reynolds. Rex's frantic barks and scratches at the door were all the proof they needed. The K-9's instincts were rarely wrong, and his current distress was a blaring siren in the silent, suffocating mansion. Mrs. Albright, step aside, David commanded, his voice firm. Leaving no room for argument, his eyes were fixed on the tarnished brass doorknob. If you do not open this door, we will be forced to, and that will only worsen your situation. Miss Reynolds stepped forward, her hand reaching for the doorknob. Consider this your final opportunity to cooperate. Mrs. Albright seemed to crumple slightly, her shoulders slumping. Her glacial eyes, however, still held a defiant spark, a last desperate attempt to cling to her secret. You'll regret this, she hissed, her voice barely a whisper, filled with a chilling prophecy. The doorknob was stiff, unyielding, as if it hadn't been turned in years. Miss Reynolds grunted with effort, twisting it with both hands, with a loud, protesting click that seemed to pierce the very silence of the mansion. The lock gave way, a gust of stale, heavy air, thick with the scent of dust. Old books and something else, something faintly acrid, like fear and disuse, washed over them as the door slowly, agonizingly, creaked inward. The sound was like a theatrical curtain rising, revealing a stage set for a tragedy. The room beyond was small, barely larger than a walk-in closet, and almost entirely devoid of light. The single, high window was completely boarded up from the inside, plunging the space into perpetual twilight. What little light entered filtered through cracks in the boards, painting faint, spectral stripes on the dusty floor. And then they saw him, in the far corner, huddled on a threadbare cot, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, perhaps even younger. His small body was curled into a defensive ball, his knees drawn to his chest, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. He was incredibly thin, his limbs resembling fragile twigs, and his skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, as if he hadn't seen natural sunlight in years. His hair, dark and matted, fell across his face, partially obscuring eyes that, even in the gloom, seemed impossibly wide, filled with a mixture of terror and a fragile flicker of desperate hope. He wore clothes that were too large for him, tattered and grimy, hanging loosely on his emaciated frame. A single, faded, well-worn book lay discarded beside him on the cot, a tattered copy of a book on nautical flags and Morse code. David's heart clenched, a painful vice. This was the source of this S.O.S. Rex, seeing the boy, let out a deep, mournful whine, forgetting all training. The K-9 pushed past David, his powerful body trembling, and lowered himself gently beside the cot, nudging his head cautiously against the boy's trembling hand. The boy, initially flinching, slowly, hesitantly, reached out a small, bony hand and tentatively stroked Rex's fur. The dog responded with a soft lick to his palm, a silent offering of comfort. It was a moment of profound, wordless connection. Miss St. Reynolds rushed forward, her professionalism momentarily giving way to raw emotion. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp of horror. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. She knelt beside the cot, speaking in a soft, soothing voice. "It's okay, sweetie. You're safe now. My name is Sarah. This is Officer Miller. We're here to help you." The boy didn't speak. He just stared, his eyes darting between Ms. Reynolds, David, and Rex, as if trying to ascertain if this was real, if they were truly there to save him. Tears welled in his wide eyes, silent and slow, behind them. Mrs. Albright let out a choked sob. Her rigid composure had utterly shattered. She was trembling uncontrollably, her hands clutching at her chest. "Ethan," she whimpered, her voice barely audible, a sound filled with a twisted cocktail of grief, fear, and a terrifying, misguided love. "My Ethan. My son." David turned to her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Ethan, this is your grandson. Isn't it you've kept him locked in here? How long, Mrs. Albright? How long has this child been living like this?" She sank to the dusty floor, a pathetic, broken figure. The glacial facade had melted, revealing a woman consumed by despair. Her words tumbled out in a ragged torrent, interspersed with sobs and gasps for breath. "My daughter, she left him on my doorstep, years ago. She was lost, consumed by the streets, the drugs. I tried to help her, but she just disappeared. And then, my Arthur, my son, he was gone. Years before, they took him. The world took him from me. I couldn't lose another one. I couldn't bear it." She looked up at them, her eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot, but holding a terrifying glimmer of warped logic. "I was protecting him from the world, from the dangers. I gave him food, shelter. I taught him what I could. I kept him safe." David stared at the small, emaciated boy, clutching Rex like a lifeline, and then back at the distraught woman on the floor. "This is not protection, Mrs. Albright," he said, his voice quiet but laced with a profound sadness. "This is imprisonment. This is neglect. This is cruelty." The room itself was a stark testament to her words. Besides the cot, there was a small, dusty table with a few well-worn children's books, a chipped bowl, and a plastic cup. No toys, no pictures, no warmth, just the bare essentials. provided by a twisted sense of duty, not love. The air was heavy with the smell of loneliness. Ethan, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, slowly began to sit up, still clinging to Rex. He looked at David, then at Miss Reynolds. His eyes still wide but now holding a spark of something new. Not just fear, but tentative curiosity. A fragile hope. Mrs. Reynolds gently reached out and took Ethan's small hand. "Ethan," she said softly, "you are going to be okay. We are going to get you out of here, and you will be safe." Mrs. Albright's sobs grew louder, a desperate wail that seemed to fill the entire mansion. The grand, silent house, a monument to her grief and her secrets, was finally unburdening itself, revealing the hidden horror it had held captive for so long. The truth, long suppressed, had finally been exposed. Thanks to a desperate S.O.S. and the unwavering loyalty of a guest 9 dog. What happened next? David knew. Would change everything for everyone involved. The air in the small, desolate room hung heavy with the stench of neglect and the raw emotion of Mrs. Albright's confession. Sarah Reynolds, ever the professional, gently guided Ethan away from the cot. The boy, still clinging to Rex, slowly unwrapped himself from the dog's protective embrace, his eyes wide as he took in the unfamiliar faces of his rescuers. Rex, sensing the boy was safe for the moment, nudged his head against Ethan's leg once more before settling quietly beside him. A silent sentinel. "Ethan, can you tell me your name?" Miss Reynolds asked softly, her voice reassuring. The boy's lips trembled. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if the words were foreign objects. Finally, a whisper, barely audible. "Ethan, how old are you?" "Ethan," David asked, his voice gentle despite the anger still simmering beneath his composure. 10, he managed, his voice raspy, unused. 10 years old. 10 years living in this forgotten room, hidden from the world. The realization hit David with the force of a physical blow. He thought of the vibrant, noisy lives of 10-year-olds he knew, full of school, friends, and sunshine. Ethan had none of that. His world had been this cramped. Dusty cell. Mrs. Reynolds began a preliminary assessment, her trained eyes noting the boy's extreme pallor, the gauntness of his cheeks, the dark circles under his eyes, and the signs of malnourishment. She checked his pulse, his breathing, and gently felt his forehead. "He needs medical attention." "David, immediately." David nodded, already pulling out his phone to call for an ambulance. "And Child Protective Services needs to be notified officially for a full investigation." Mrs. Albright, still sobbing on the floor, seemed oblivious to their conversation. Her world had just imploded, years of carefully guarded secrets tumbling out like brittle fragments. She rocked back and forth, muttering, "My Ethan, my son," over and over, lost in her own grief and delusion. "Mrs. Albright," Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice firm, cutting through the haze of the woman's despair. "We need to understand, why did you do this? Why keep him hidden?" Mrs. Albright slowly raised her head, her eyes vacant and bloodshot. "They took Arthur," she whispered, her voice a ghost of its former severity. "The world, it took my only son. He just vanished. One day, he was there. The next, gone. The police found nothing. They gave up. But I never gave up hope." She paused, a shiver running through her thin frame. "When my daughter, Lily, showed up with Ethan, my Lily, so broken, so lost to her addiction, and then she left him, just like Arthur left me. I couldn't let the world take him too. I thought I was protecting him, keeping him safe from all the evil out there." Her words painted a horrifying picture of a grief-stricken mind, twisted by fear and loss. She saw the world as a predator and her home as a fortress. But in her warped attempt to protect, she had become the very thing she feared. She had stolen Ethan's childhood, his freedom, his health. How did he learn Morse code? David asked, gesturing to the book. Ethan, his eyes still fixed on the tattered book, finally spoke again, his voice a little stronger. From here, it was the only book in the room. I saw your car go by sometimes. Through the cracks, I hoped someone would see when I heard the siren close. I knew it was now or never. I flashed the light from a broken mirror shard. I saw you stop. His words confirmed David's instincts, a vindication that brought a fresh wave of emotion. This boy, alone and trapped, had possessed an incredible resilience, a spark of hope that had driven him to reach out into the unknown. The paramedics arrived quickly, their trained efficiency cutting through the emotional weight of the scene. They gently assessed Ethan, their expressions growing serious as they noted his condition. Malnourished, possible dehydration, severe lack of sunlight exposure. We need to get him to the hospital immediately for a full evaluation. One paramedic stated. Ethan flinched when they tried to move him, his small hands instinctively reaching for Rex. Can he come? He whispered, his eyes pleading. David looked at the paramedics. He's a K-9 officer. He's been with the boy since we found him. He seems to be a source of comfort. The lead paramedic, seeing the bond, nodded. All right, for now, but he'll have to stay with you in the waiting area once we get to the hospital. As they carefully helped Ethan onto a stretcher, Rex walked protectively beside him, his tail giving a soft, reassuring wag. Mrs. Albright watched them go, her face a mixture of despair and a strange, quiet resignation. Meanwhile, other officers had arrived, summoned by David for backup. Mrs. Albright was formally placed under arrest, her rights read to her. She offered no resistance, seeming utterly defeated as the handcuffs clicked. She looked at David, her eyes surprisingly clear for a moment. You don't understand, she whispered, a deep sorrow in her voice. I was just trying to protect him, to keep him safe from what took my Arthur. David knew that her grief, however profound, did not excuse her actions. Her love had been a prison, but looking at the broken woman, he couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. Her tragedy had consumed her, turning her into a perpetrator out of a twisted sense of protection. The justice system would have to untangle the complexities of her mental state and her crimes. As Mrs. Albright was led away, the silence in the mansion returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, no longer heavy with untold secrets, but with the lingering echoes of a child's suffering and a woman's tragic delusion. David followed the ambulance to the hospital, Rex riding quietly beside him. He couldn't shake the image of Ethan's emaciated form, or the raw desperation in his eyes as he flashed that S.O.S. signal. But he also felt a profound sense of relief, a quiet triumph. They had gotten to him. They had broken through the silence and the secrets. And it was all thanks to a child's incredible bravery and the unshakable instinct of his loyal K-9 partner. The long road to recovery for Ethan was just beginning, but at least now, he had a chance. A real chance at a life beyond the dusty. Boarded-up walls of the Albright mansion, the hospital waiting room hummed with a low, anxious energy. David sat on a surprisingly uncomfortable plastic chair, his uniform still slightly dusty from the Albright mansion, and Rex lay sprawled at his feet, his usually vigilant eyes now heavy-lidded. The K-9 had been allowed to accompany them this far, his presence a quiet comfort to Ethan, who was now undergoing a battery of tests behind closed doors. Ms. Reynolds sat beside David, making calls on her phone, her voice hushed and professional as she briefed various departments. Child Protective Services was already mobilizing. Legal procedures were being set in motion. The gears of bureaucracy, once slow and resistant, were now turning with surprising speed. Spurred by the stark reality of Ethan's condition, David's mind replayed the scene in the mansion, the desolate room, Ethan's terrified eyes, Mrs. Albright's heartbreaking confession. He thought about the vast difference between her intent, protecting her grandson, and the brutal reality of his confinement. It was a tragic paradox, a mother's grief twisted into a grandmother's cruel delusion. He wondered what would become of her, a woman so utterly consumed by her past that she had destroyed a child's present. A nurse, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, approached them. "Ethan is stable," she reported, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "He's severely malnourished and dehydrated. As suspected, his muscle mass is very low, likely from lack of movement and poor nutrition. He also shows signs of severe sunlight deprivation, with very pale skin and some vitamin D deficiency. But," she emphasized, her voice brightening, "there are no immediate life-threatening injuries. He's very quiet, very withdrawn. But he's responding to simple commands. He just needs time, proper nutrition, and a lot of emotional support." David felt a profound wave of relief wash over him. So potent, it left him momentarily lightheaded. He looked down at Rex, who seemed to sense the good news. Letting out a soft grunt and nudging David's leg. "Can we see him?" David asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just yet, officer." The nurse replied gently, "He's going to be admitted. He needs rest, and we'll be starting him on a refeeding program. But I wanted to let you know he's going to be all right. You two, you saved his life. He was very weak." Mrs. Reynolds finished her call and looked at David. "CPS is arranging for a temporary foster placement, a family that specializes in trauma-informed care. He'll be safe there." The mention of a foster family brought a fresh wave of concern. David knew how difficult it could be for children to adjust, especially those who had experienced such profound isolation and trauma. "Will he be able to see Rex?" he asked, a desperate hope in his voice. "He seemed to connect with him." Mr. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "We can certainly request it. Animal-assisted therapy is often very beneficial for children who've experienced trauma. We'll make sure the foster family is amenable." Rex clearly made an impression. Over the next few days, David found himself consumed by the aftermath. He wrote his official report, detailing every chilling aspect of the discovery, carefully crafting his words to ensure that the reasonable and articulable suspicion he'd initially relied upon was now irrefutable fact. Sergeant Davies read the report with a grim face, offering a terse but sincere apology for his initial skepticism. "You followed your gut. Miller, good call. A life was saved." It was a small concession, but it meant a lot coming from Davies. The local news picked up the story, albeit with a delicate touch, avoiding graphic details out of respect for the child's privacy. The Albright Mansion, once a symbol of reclusive mystery, now became a somber landmark, a silent witness to a hidden tragedy. The town of Oakwood, usually so placid, was shaken. Whispers turned to outright outrage, but also to a collective sorrow for both the boy and the misguided woman who had imprisoned him. Meanwhile, Mrs. Albright was formally charged with child endangerment, abuse, and unlawful imprisonment. Her lawyer immediately moved for a psychiatric evaluation, citing her fragile mental state and her decades-long grief over her lost son. The legal proceedings would be long and complex, a dance between justice and compassion, punishment and understanding. David made sure to visit Ethan every day. Even when he was off duty, he would bring Rex, who was allowed into a special quiet room in the pediatric ward. The bond between the boy and the K-9 grew stronger with each visit. Ethan, still incredibly quiet, would light up when Rex padded into the room, a faint smile touching his lips. He would bury his face in Rex's thick fur, finding a comfort and a connection he hadn't known existed. David would sit and talk to him about Rex, about the outside world, about anything to fill the void of his isolated past. He'd read him stories, simple tales of brave heroes and loyal companions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ethan began to transform. The color returned to his cheeks. He started gaining weight. His eyes, once so vacant and terrified, began to hold a spark of curiosity, of gentle wonder. He would ask questions, simple ones at first, then more complex, about everything from how Rex learned his commands to what the sky looked like outside the hospital window. One afternoon, during a visit, Ethan looked at David, his voice still soft but now clear. You saved me. And Rex. David smiled. A genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. We saw your signal. Ethan, you were very brave to send it. Ethan nodded, then gestured to Rex. He's a good dog. He knew. He did, David agreed, stroking Rex's head. He always knows. The path to recovery for Ethan was long, paved with therapy, nutrition, and a painstaking process of learning to trust and live in a world he barely knew. But every day, David saw small victories, a louder laugh, a longer conversation, a bolder step, and every day, Rex was there, a furry anchor, a silent promise of unwavering loyalty and unconditional love. The boy who had flashed an S.O.S into the void was slowly, surely, beginning to live again. Weeks bled into months, marking Ethan's slow, steady ascent from the darkness of his confinement into the tentative light of a new life. He was now living with the Millers, a kind, middle-aged couple, chosen by Miss Reynolds for their calm demeanor and experience with children from challenging backgrounds. Their home, a cozy bungalow with a sprawling backyard, was a world away from the cold, sterile confines of the Albright mansion. Ethan's initial days there were fraught with anxiety. He would flinch at sudden noises, shy away from direct eye contact, and his small hands would nervously pick at the seams of his clothes. The simple act of eating a meal at a table with other people was an alien concept, one he approached with a mixture of fear and wonder. He had to learn the rhythm of everyday life, the sound of a television, the feel of clean sheets, the warmth of a bath, the freedom of a backyard. But his biggest comfort remained Rex. The K9 was a constant, patient presence. Rex would lie by Ethan's bed at night, a furry guardian against the lingering nightmares. During the day, he'd follow Ethan around the house, his tail a slow, reassuring thump on the floor. When Ethan hesitated, unsure how to interact with the outside world, Rex was his bridge. The boy would often whisper secrets into the dog's fur, finding solace in the silent understanding of his loyal companion. David continued his daily visits, even on his days off. He wasn't just an officer anymore, he was a mentor, a steady hand guiding Ethan through this bewildering new world. He taught Ethan how to throw a baseball, how to skip stones across a pond, how to identify constellations in the vast. Open night sky, simple joys that had been brutally denied him. He patiently answered Ethan's endless questions about the world outside, feeding his starved curiosity. One afternoon, David found Ethan sitting in the backyard, sketching furiously in a new notebook he'd given him. Rex was curled up beside him, occasionally nudging his hand with his nose. David knelt beside them, peering over Ethan's shoulder. The pages were filled with intricate, detailed drawings of the stars, of trees, of animals, of things Ethan had only read about or glimpsed from his small window. There was a raw, undeniable talent in his quick, confident strokes. These are amazing, Ethan. David praised, genuinely impressed. You have a real gift. Ethan looked up, a faint blush coloring his pale cheeks. They're what I remember from the books. And what you told me, I see them now, in my head. It was a profound moment. Ethan wasn't just drawing what he saw, he was drawing what he imagined, what he hoped for. He was reclaiming his world, piece by piece. Meanwhile, the legal battle surrounding Mrs. Albright continued. The psychiatric evaluation confirmed what David and Ms. Reynolds had suspected: she was suffering from profound grief and a severe, untreated mental health disorder stemming from the disappearance of her son, compounded by the subsequent loss of her daughter to addiction. This wasn't a case of inherent malice, but a tragic descent into delusion, where her love had been twisted into a form of imprisonment. The public outcry was immense. The media, sensitive to the delicate nature of the case, painted Mrs. Albright as a pitiable figure, a victim of her own untreated trauma. This shifted the narrative slightly, moving from pure condemnation to a more nuanced understanding of the complex factors at play. However, the charges of child endangerment and unlawful imprisonment still stood. During one of his visits to Ethan, Ms. Reynolds broke some unexpected news. "Ethan," she began gently, "we found your mother." Ethan's head shot up. His mother. The woman who had left him on Mrs. Albright's doorstep. A shadowy figure from the distant past. He barely remembered her face. Just fragments of a life before the mansion walls closed in. She's in a recovery program far away," Mrs. Reynolds explained. "When news of Mrs. Albright's arrest reached her, she broke down. She's been clean for over a year now, and she's desperate to see you, to make amends." David watched Ethan closely. The boy's face was a mixture of confusion and a nascent curiosity. It was a lot to process. A mother he barely knew. Now wanting to re-enter his life. It's okay to feel whatever you feel. "Ethan?" David said softly, seeing the turmoil in his eyes. "No one expects you to forgive or forget anything. This is about your choice." Ethan looked at Rex, who nudged his hand. He looked at David, then at Miss Reynolds. "Is she safe?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question wasn't about physical safety, David realized, but emotional. Was she stable? Would she leave him again? Ms. Reynolds knelt beside him. "She is, Ethan. She's been working very hard on herself. She wants to be a good mother to you." The first meeting was arranged in a neutral, supervised setting. David and Rex were present, as was Miss Reynolds. Lily, Ethan's mother, was a pale, nervous woman, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a desperate longing. She looked nothing like the troubled, addicted woman Mrs. Albright had described. She was clean, fragile, but visibly trying. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. She held out a small, worn teddy bear. "This was yours. From when you were a baby. I never forgot you." Ethan stared at the bear, then at her. He didn't move. Rex, sensing his hesitation, nudged him forward gently, slowly. Ethan reached out and took the teddy bear. He clutched it to his chest, his eyes fixed on his mother's face. Lily began to weep. Quiet, heartbroken sobs. "I am so sorry, my beautiful boy." She choked out. "I was so lost. I left you with my mother because I was sick. I never meant for this to happen. I never stopped loving you." It was a raw, emotional reunion, full of pain and tentative hope. Ethan didn't embrace her, didn't immediately forgive. The scars of his past were too deep, but he didn't pull away either. He listened, he watched, he processed. David knew this was just the beginning of another long journey for Ethan. A journey of rebuilding, of learning to trust, of potentially forging a new, fragile connection with a mother he barely knew. But seeing Ethan clutching that teddy bear, a symbol of a past he couldn't remember, David felt a profound sense of hope. The boy, who had once been a prisoner of darkness, was now on a path towards a future filled with choice, with healing, and with the possibility of a new kind of family. And he wouldn't be alone. He had David, Miss Reynolds, the Millers, and, of course, his loyal K9 Rex, guiding him every step of the way. The tentative reconnection between Ethan and Lily was a delicate dance, often taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Lily, having completed her rehabilitation program, was a different woman from the phantom figure Mrs. Albright had described. She was fragile, yes, but earnest, her eyes clear, filled with a raw longing for her son. She attended every supervised visit, eager to learn about the boy she barely remembered. Listening intently to Miss Reynolds' guidance and David's observations, Ethan, for his part, remained cautious. The years of isolation had left deep imprints, a natural distrust of abrupt changes and unfamiliar faces. He'd observe Lily from a distance, clutching Rex's fur, absorbing every nuance of her expressions, every tremor in her voice. He asked David countless questions about her. Is she really better? Will she stay? Does she know about this? Oh. Yet, David answered truthfully, offering reassurance without making promises he couldn't keep. One afternoon, during a visit at a park, Lily brought a small, intricately carved wooden bird. Your grandfather made these, she told Ethan, her voice soft. He was a carpenter. He used to carve them for me when I was little. This one. This one looks like an owl. They say owls are wise, and they see things others don't. Ethan took the bird, turning it over in his small hands. He looked at Lily, a flicker of something new in his eyes. Curiosity. Perhaps even a nascent bond. It was a small but significant breakthrough. He kept the owl, placing it on his nightstand next to the old Morse code book and a framed photo of David and Rex. Meanwhile, Mrs. Albright's legal case moved slowly through the system. The psychiatric evaluations painted a picture of a woman suffering from a complex tapestry of grief, delusion, and untreated mental illness. Her legal team argued for leniency, emphasizing her profound suffering and the fact that, in her twisted mind, she believed she was protecting Ethan. They presented evidence of her son Arthur's disappearance, the unresolved trauma that had consumed her for decades. The prosecution, led by a no-nonsense assistant district attorney, acknowledged the mitigating circumstances but emphasized the severity of Ethan's neglect and emotional abuse. They presented medical reports detailing Ethan's malnourishment, his developmental delays, and the psychological impact of his prolonged isolation. David was called to testify, recounting the chilling discovery, the S.O.S signal, and Rex's undeniable distress. His testimony was calm, factual, but imbued with an unspoken emotional weight that resonated with the court. Rex, too, became a quiet sensation. The story of the K9's unerring instinct, his agitated barks at the locked door, and his protective presence beside Ethan in the hospital, captivated the public. He was hailed as a hero, a symbol of unwavering loyalty and the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. Dog lovers rallied, sending Rex countless toys and treats, and even a new, custom-made vest. David ensured Rex received all the praise, often joking that the K9 enjoyed the attention more than any human. As the court proceedings continued, Miss Reynolds worked tirelessly to ensure Ethan's long-term well-being. She advocated for him to remain in foster care with the Millers, emphasizing the stability they provided and his progress there. She also facilitated weekly, supervised visits with Lily, carefully monitoring the slow, fragile rebuilding of their relationship. One evening, David sat with Ethan in the Millers' backyard, watching the fireflies blink in the twilight. Ethan was quieter than usual. "What's on your mind?" Buddy David asked. Sensing the boy's contemplation, Ethan picked at the grass My grandma, Mrs. Albright, will she go to jail? David sighed. It was a complex question. She's done some very wrong things, Ethan, and there have to be consequences for that. But she's also very, very sick because she lost her son a long time ago. Sometimes people do bad things because they're hurt or afraid, or because their minds get twisted by sadness. She said she was protecting me, Ethan whispered, his voice small, from the world. She believed that. Ethan, David said gently. But it wasn't true protection. True protection means helping you grow, helping you learn, helping you be free. It means letting you see the sun and learn about the world, not hiding you away. He put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. What she did was wrong, and you have every right to be angry or sad or confused. But you're safe now, and you're free. Ethan nodded slowly, contemplating David's words. He still struggled with the concept of his grandmother's actions. How could someone who supposedly loved him inflict such pain? It was a wound that would take a long time to heal. The courtroom drama eventually reached its climax. The prosecution argued for a significant prison sentence. Citing the severity of the neglect, the defense pleaded for compassion, highlighting Mrs. Albright's profound mental health issues and her desperate, albeit misguided, desire to protect. The judge listened patiently, the weight of the decision evident on her face. In a pivotal moment, Lily, Ethan's mother, was allowed to submit a written statement to the court. She wrote of her own struggles with addiction, her regret for abandoning her son, and her newfound sobriety. She didn't defend her mother's actions, but she acknowledged the depth of her mother's pain, and she spoke of her hopes for both her son's and her mother's healing. It was a plea for understanding, not just for her mother, but for the cycle of trauma that had ensnared their family. David felt the court's tension. This wasn't a simple case of good versus evil. It was a tragedy born of tragedy. He knew that whatever the outcome, it wouldn't undo the years Ethan had lost, but it could set a precedent for compassion and rehabilitation, even for those who had committed serious wrongs. The pursuit of justice, David was learning, sometimes meant more than just punishment. It also meant understanding and perhaps a chance for redemption. The truth had been revealed, but the path forward remained uncertain, yet filled with the fragile promise of healing for all involved. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver her verdict on Mrs. Albright's fate. Ethan, too young to be present for the most graphic testimonies, was thankfully spared the full weight of the proceedings. But the outcome would undoubtedly shape his future. David sat in the gallery, Rex calmly at his feet, his paw resting lightly on David's boot. Beside him was Mrs. Reynolds, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Though David knew she held immense compassion for both the victim and, in a complicated way, the perpetrator, the judge, a woman known for her thoughtful and equitable rulings, began to speak, her voice clear and resonant. She meticulously outlined the charges: child endangerment, abuse, and unlawful imprisonment. She acknowledged the overwhelming evidence of Ethan's physical and psychological neglect. Detailing the medical reports and expert testimonies, the court finds the defendant, Eleanor Albright, guilty on all counts. The judge stated, her voice unwavering. A collective sigh rippled through the gallery. Mrs. Albright, seated at the defense table, remained stoic, her face devoid of expression, but a tremor ran through her clasped hands. Then, the judge shifted. However, she continued, the court has also carefully considered the extensive psychiatric evaluations and the tragic circumstances that led to these crimes. Mrs. Albright's actions, while inexcusable and deeply damaging to the child, were not born of malice, but of a profound, untreated mental health crisis rooted in the devastating loss of her son, Arthur, decades ago. Her grief, coupled with fear and isolation, tragically warped her perception of reality, leading her to believe she was protecting her grandson. She spoke of the cycle of trauma, of Lily's struggles with addiction, and the intergenerational pain that had culminated in Ethan's suffering. Justice in this case, the judge pronounced, must serve not only to punish wrongdoing but also to facilitate healing and prevent future harm. It must acknowledge the complexities of human suffering. The judge then delivered the sentence. Mrs. Albright was to serve a significant period in a secure psychiatric facility, not a conventional prison. This would be followed by a term of supervised probation, contingent on continued mental health treatment and a strict no-contact order with Ethan, unless deemed safe and beneficial by a court-appointed therapist in the distant future. She was also ordered to pay restitution for Ethan's ongoing medical and psychological care. It was a sentence that balanced accountability with rehabilitation, punishment with compassion. It was a recognition that Mrs. Albright was both a criminal and a deeply troubled individual. David watched as Mrs. Albright's stoic facade finally crumbled. A single tear tracked a path down her gaunt cheek, then another, until she was openly weeping, silent. Trembling sobs that racked her entire body. It was the first true emotion David had seen from her since the day they opened that door. A raw, agonizing release of decades of pent-up sorrow and regret. It wasn't the furious, defensive tears of a woman caught, but the heartbroken tears of a woman finally confronted with the true, devastating consequences of her actions, and perhaps a glimmer of her own long-denied pain. Later that day, Ms. Reynolds facilitated a meeting between David, Ethan, and Lily. Ethan had been informed of the verdict, explained in simple, age-appropriate terms by Ms. Reynolds. He understood that his grandmother was sick and would be getting help, and that he was now permanently safe. "Ethan," Lily began, her voice soft but firm. "There's something else. The house, the Albright mansion?" She paused, taking a deep breath. It's being sold. All the assets will be liquidated. A significant portion will go into a trust fund for your care and future, as ordered by the court." Ethan looked at her, then at David. The mansion was the only home he had ever known. Even if it was a prison, it will be a fresh start. "Ethan," David offered gently, "a chance to build new memories in a different place. A place that's full of life and light." Lily continued, her eyes holding a distant sadness. "And a small portion of the proceeds will be used to establish a local charity, in Arthur's name, a fund for children facing similar situations, to ensure no child in this town is ever left unseen or unheard again." It was a surprising revelation, a way for the Albright family's legacy of tragedy to, perhaps, finally yield something positive. Ethan spent the next few months living with the Millers, growing stronger, both physically and emotionally. He excelled in his new school, showing an astonishing aptitude for learning, especially in reading and history. His artistic talent blossomed. His drawings became more vibrant, reflecting the colorful world he was finally allowed to experience. He started to make friends, tentative at first, then more confident, learning the give and take of childhood relationships. His relationship with Lily continued to mend, slowly, cautiously. They shared meals, went for walks, and read books together. Lily was patient, never pushing, always listening. She was rebuilding her life too, finding work as a graphic designer, pouring her newfound sobriety and stability into creating a safe, loving environment for Ethan. The bond was still fragile, but it was growing, nurtured by shared vulnerability and a mutual desire for a brighter future. Rex remained Ethan's steadfast companion. He often accompanied David on visits, settling near Ethan, a silent anchor in the boy's rapidly expanding world. Rex's calm presence allowed Ethan to feel grounded, safe enough to explore his new freedoms. The boy who once knew only the silent desperation of an S.O.S. was now learning the language of love, trust, and connection. The tears that once flowed from fear and loneliness were slowly being replaced by tears of joy, relief, and the quiet comfort of belonging. Justice had been served, and with it, a profound healing had begun. Life, for Ethan, began to unfold in vibrant, unexpected ways. The once gaunt, withdrawn boy was slowly replaced by a bright, inquisitive child. He devoured books, compensated for years of lost education with an astonishing eagerness. His artistic talent, nurtured by the Millers, grew by leaps and bounds. His sketchbooks, once filled with imagined landscapes, now depicted the real world around him, the vibrant hues of autumn leaves, the intricate patterns of snowflakes, the joyful chaos of children playing in the park. His connection with Lily, his mother, continued its gradual, often fragile, mending. Their visits, now less formal and more frequent, allowed them to discover each other, piece by painful piece. Lily shared stories of her childhood, of Ethan's grandparents, of a life before addiction took hold. Ethan, in turn, hesitantly recounted snippets of his isolated existence. The strange comfort he found in the Morse code book, the fleeting moments of hope when he saw David's patrol car, these shared vulnerabilities, though difficult, forged a new kind of intimacy, one built on honesty and a desperate desire for a second chance. Mrs. Reynolds remained a vital figure in Ethan's life, a steadfast advocate ensuring his needs were met. She saw the profound transformation in him, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She also continued to monitor Mrs. Albright's progress in the psychiatric facility, receiving reports that indicated a slow but steady path toward stability. The once icy facade of Mrs. Albright was softening, replaced by a profound, if still unspoken, remorse. The raw grief that had consumed her for decades was, at last, being addressed. David, however, was perhaps the most consistent anchor in Ethan's new life. He was more than an officer, he was a friend, a father figure, a hero in the truest sense of the word. He introduced Ethan to the simple joys he'd missed fishing in the local pond, building sandcastles at the beach, even taking him on carefully orchestrated educational visits to the police station to see Rex's training exercises. Rex, of course, remained Ethan's loyal shadow. He was an unofficial therapy dog, his calm presence a constant source of comfort and security. When Ethan struggled with nightmares, Rex would curl up by his bed. When he felt overwhelmed by new experiences, a gentle nuzzle from Rex would calm him. The K9's steadfast, unconditional love provided a unique healing balm that no human therapy could fully replicate. One sunny afternoon, David took Ethan and Rex to a large, open field on the outskirts of Oakwood. It was a beautiful day, the sky a brilliant blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds. Ethan, now stronger and more coordinated, laughed as he tried to throw a frisbee for Rex. His throw still a bit wobbly, but filled with joyous effort. He's really thriving. David, Miss Reynolds observed, joining them after wrapping up a meeting. It's remarkable to see. He's a strong kid. David agreed, watching Ethan chase after Rex, a genuine smile lighting up his face. And he's got good people around him now. The conversation naturally turned to Mrs. Albright. Her doctors say she's responding well to treatment, Mr. Reynolds said, her voice thoughtful. She's beginning to process Arthur's disappearance in a healthier way. The delusion, the belief she was protecting Ethan by isolating him, it's fading. She's finally facing the reality of what she did and the profound harm she caused. Will she ever be released? David asked, a complex mix of emotions stirring within him. He still carried the anger for Ethan's suffering, but also a strange sense of empathy for the broken woman. "It's possible, eventually," Mr. Reynolds replied, "but under very strict conditions, and a permanent no-contact order with Ethan will remain in place. Unless, perhaps decades from now, Ethan himself expresses a desire to see her, and therapists deem it safe. Her focus right now is entirely on her own recovery." The topic then shifted to the Albright mansion itself. The liquidation of assets was complete. The house, stripped of its furniture and its secrets, stood empty, waiting for its next chapter. It had been sold to a developer who planned to demolish it and build a community park and affordable housing units. The trust fund for Ethan is substantial. Miss Anna Reynolds informed them. It will cover his education, his continued therapy, and provide a secure foundation for his future, and the charity Lily helped set up, the Arthur Albright Memorial Fund for Unseen Children, is already making a difference. Providing resources for social workers and anonymous tip lines for potential neglect cases, David felt a profound sense of closure. The mansion, once a symbol of imprisonment, would become a space for growth and community. The tragedy of Arthur Albright's disappearance, which had twisted one family, was now spurring a positive change for countless others. Later that evening, as David drove Ethan back to the Miller's home, Ethan was quieter than usual. He looked out the window, watching the streetlights pass by. "What's up, buddy?" David asked. Ethan turned to him, his eyes serious. Will I ever be truly normal?" "Officer David." The question hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. David pulled over to the side of the road, putting the car in park. He looked at Ethan, then at Rex, who had nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. "Ethan," David began, his voice soft but firm, "there's no such thing as normal. Everyone has their own story, their own struggles. What happened to you? It was a terrible, terrible thing. And it's a part of your story. It always will be. But it doesn't define you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What defines you is your courage. The courage to send that S.O.S. even when you were terrified. The courage to learn to trust again. The courage to heal. You are one of the strongest, bravest kids I know. And you have a whole life ahead of you. A beautiful life, full of possibilities. You are more than normal. Ethan, you are extraordinary." Ethan looked at him, a faint, shy smile touching his lips. He looked at Rex, who thumped his tail softly. A silent understanding passed between them. The boy who had been trapped in darkness was now bathed in the light of unconditional acceptance and hope. The past would always be a part of him, a scar, but it would no longer be a cage. He was free, truly free, to become the person he was meant to be. The journey had been long, marked by tears of despair, but now, the tears were those of healing, of gratitude, and of a future finally within reach. The seasons turned, painting Oakwood in shades of vibrant green, then fiery red, and finally the crisp white of winter. With each passing month, Ethan shed more of the ghosts of his past. He embraced his new life with a quiet determination, his innate curiosity serving as a powerful engine for learning and growth. School, once an unimaginable concept, became a source of fascination. He devoured subjects like history and science, his sharp mind soaking up knowledge like a sponge. His drawings, once a solitary escape, now became a way to connect, to share his unique perspective on the world. His foster parents, the Millers, provided a nurturing, stable home. They understood his need for routine and quiet reflection, yet gently encouraged him to explore, to play, to simply be a child. David remained a constant, unwavering presence. He was there for every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every milestone. Their bond deepened into something akin to family, built on shared trust and a profound mutual respect. Rex, David's K9 partner, was still Ethan's closest confidant. The dog seemed to understand Ethan's unspoken needs, offering a comforting nuzzle or a quiet presence whenever the boy was overwhelmed or simply needed a silent companion. They were inseparable, often found together in the backyard, Rex patiently observing Ethan's artistic endeavors, or playfully chasing a ball. The relationship between Ethan and Lily, his biological mother, continued to blossom. Lily, now over 2 years sober, was a testament to the power of recovery and unwavering dedication. She had secured a stable job, rented a small, comfortable apartment, and was steadily building a life of responsibility and quiet purpose. Her visits with Ethan, initially supervised by Mrs. Reynolds, gradually transitioned to unsupervised outings. Then overnight stays at her apartment. Lily never pressed Ethan for immediate affection or forgiveness. She understood the depth of the trauma he had endured, much of which was a direct consequence of her own past choices. Instead, she offered consistency, honesty, and a profound, quiet love. She listened intently when he spoke, answered his questions with sincerity, and shared stories from her own life, creating a tapestry of shared experience that slowly wove them together. One afternoon, Lily brought Ethan to a small, unassuming grave in the Oakwood Cemetery. It was a simple headstone, weathered by time, Arthur Albright, beloved son, gone too soon. Ethan stood quietly beside her, looking at the name, the vague image of his great-uncle, the man whose disappearance had set in motion the tragic events that led to his own imprisonment. Lily knelt, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers on the grave. "This was my brother. Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Grandma, she never got over losing him. It changed her. And then, when I was sick, and I left you, she just couldn't bear to lose anyone else." Her voice cracked. It doesn't excuse what she did. Not at all. But it helps to understand the sadness that drove her. Ethan looked at the gravestone, then at his mother. A profound understanding seemed to settle over him, a sense of the intergenerational sorrow that had shaped his family. It didn't erase his pain, but it offered a flicker of context, a pathway towards a nuanced understanding of a complex tragedy. He reached out and, for the first time without prompting, gently took Lily's hand. It was a silent gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the healing taking place between them. The news from the psychiatric facility regarding Mrs. Albright was cautiously optimistic. Her therapist reported significant progress. She was confronting her grief, processing Arthur's disappearance, and, for the first time in decades, openly acknowledging the immense harm she had inflicted on Ethan. She expressed profound remorse, a deep, aching regret that was now genuine. The delusion had lifted, leaving behind a frail, remorseful woman. "She's asked about Ethan," Miss Reynolds informed David one day, not demanding a visit, but she asked if he's happy, if he's safe. It's a sign of genuine recovery. Officer Miller, a true shift from her previous state. David listened, his expression thoughtful. He knew a reunion was still years away, and only if Ethan ever chose it. But the thought that Mrs. Albright was finally facing her truth, was finally allowing herself to feel the pain of her actions, offered a strange sense of closure. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was also about the possibility of rehabilitation, even for the most broken among them. As for the Albright mansion, it was finally demolished. David watched from a distance as the wrecking ball swung, tearing down the walls that had once held Ethan captive. It wasn't a sad sight, it was a liberating one. The dust that rose was not of decay, but of a past finally being cleared away to make room for a new future. In its place, a vibrant community park began to take shape. Playgrounds with colorful swings and slides, walking paths winding through newly planted trees, and a central gazebo where local musicians could perform. The Arthur Albright Memorial Fund for Unseen Children had flourished, providing resources for at-risk youth and training for social workers to identify and assist children like Ethan, ensuring that no cry for help, no silent S.O.S. would ever go unnoticed in Oakwood again. Ethan, now 11, was thriving. He was a regular, happy kid, with a love for drawing, a growing circle of friends, and an unbreakable bond with his police officer hero and his K-9 companion. His past was not forgotten, but it no longer defined him. It was a part of his story, a testament to his incredible resilience, and a reminder of the quiet heroes who listened when others did not. The tears that now came were tears of gratitude, of laughter, and of the profound joy of finally being free. The courtroom was packed, not for a trial, but for a celebration. Mrs. Albright, pale but composed, stood before the judge. She had completed her mandated time in the psychiatric facility and, with remarkable progress, was now ready to transition to supervised release. Ethan, now 12, sat in the front row with David, Lily, and the Millers, his heart thumping with a mix of apprehension and something akin to closure. Rex, ever present, lay calmly at David's feet. The judge, the same one who had presided over Mrs. Albright's sentencing, looked at the former recluse with a compassionate gaze. "Mrs. Albright," she began, "your journey has been long and difficult. The court acknowledges the profound progress you have made in understanding the nature of your illness and the devastating impact of your actions. Your remorse is evident, and your commitment to continued treatment is commendable." Mrs. Albright's voice, once brittle and sharp, was now soft, imbued with a fragile humility. I can never truly atone for what I did to Ethan." "Your Honor," she said, her eyes briefly meeting Ethan's. A flicker of pain, then deep regret, crossed her face. "But I will spend the rest of my life trying to live honorably, to contribute, and to find a way to make peace with the past." The judge nodded. "Under the terms of your release, you will remain under strict supervision, continue therapy, and abide by a permanent no-contact order with Ethan, unless he, at a later date, and with therapeutic guidance, chooses otherwise. The court wishes you well on your continued path to healing." As Mrs. Albright was escorted out, the silence in the courtroom was not of tension, but of a quiet, collective sigh of relief. Justice had been served, tempered with mercy, allowing for a future of rehabilitation rather than endless incarceration. Later that afternoon, a smaller, more intimate gathering took place at the new Oakwood Community Park. The vibrant space, once the desolate grounds of the Albright Mansion, was now teeming with life. Children laughed on the playground, couples strolled along the walking paths, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. At the heart of the park stood a newly unveiled plaque, elegantly engraved, "Oakwood Community Park dedicated to hope and new beginnings, in memory of Arthur Albright, and for the unseen children. May every silent S.O.S be heard." David stood beside Ethan, Lily, and the Millers as the mayor delivered a short, heartfelt speech. He spoke of the town's resilience, the importance of community vigilance, and the extraordinary bravery of a young boy who had dared to signal for help. He also acknowledged the unwavering dedication of Officer David Miller and his K-9 partner, Rex, prompting a round of applause that made Rex's tail thump contentedly against David's leg. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he clutched a small, worn piece of paper in his hand. His voice, once a whisper, was now clear and steady, filled with a newfound confidence. "My name is Ethan," he began, looking out at the faces gathered before him. "A long time ago, I was lost, I was alone, and I felt like no one would ever find me." He paused, taking a breath. But then, I saw a police car, and I remembered a book about Morse code. I flashed an S.O.S. He looked directly at David, a profound gratitude shining in his eyes. Officer David and Rex. They saw me. They heard my signal. They saved me. And because of them, I learned that even when things are very, very dark, there is always hope. There are always people who will listen, who will help. He then looked at Lily, a gentle smile on his face. And I found my mother. She's helping me learn about a past I don't remember. And she's building a new future for us. And the Millers. They gave me a home and showed me what a real family is. Finally, Ethan looked out at the bustling park, a wide, genuine smile spreading across his face. This park, it's a happy place now, where a sad old house used to be. It shows that even bad things can turn into something good, and it means no one has to be unseen or unheard ever again, as he finished. Tears welled in the eyes of many in the crowd, tears of sadness for what Ethan had endured, but overwhelming tears of joy for his triumph, for the justice that had been served, and for the hope that now bloomed in Oakwood. Lily pulled Ethan into a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. But these were tears of pure, unadulterated relief and love. David watched them, a lump forming in his own throat. He knelt and stroked Rex's head, the K-9 officer letting out a soft rumble of contentment. This was why he became a cop. Not for the glory, but for moments like these. To be the one who listens, who sees, who intervenes. To bring light into the darkest of places. Years passed. Ethan grew into a bright, compassionate young man. He continued to excel academically, eventually earning a scholarship to a prestigious art school. His artwork, deeply moving and evocative, often explored themes of resilience, light and shadow, and the hidden beauty in unexpected places. He sometimes spoke publicly about his experiences, using his voice to advocate for children in need, ensuring that his own S.O.S. would serve as a beacon for others. Lily remained sober and became a devoted, loving mother, her life a testament to second chances. She eventually went back to school herself, pursuing a degree in social work. Inspired by Misty Reynolds and her desire to help families struggling with addiction and trauma, Mrs. Albright continued her treatment, eventually moving to a quiet, assisted living facility. She lived a solitary life, but one filled with a quiet dignity, finding solace in gardening and donating to various children's charities. She never directly contacted Ethan, respecting the court order and his space, but she sent anonymous donations to the Arthur Albright Memorial Fund, a silent act of penance and remembrance. Officer David Miller and Rex continued their patrols in Oakwood. Their partnership legendary? Rex, with a few more gray hairs around his muzzle, eventually retired, living out his golden years chasing squirrels in David's backyard and resting by the fireplace. He remained Ethan's loyal friend, a living reminder of the day a silent signal pierced the darkness. David, a pillar of his community, knew that every day, in every quiet corner, there were unseen battles being fought, and that vigilance, compassion, and the unwavering loyalty of a good dog could make all the difference. The S.O.S. had not just saved a boy, it had transformed a town and touched countless lives, leaving everyone in tears of both profound sorrow and overwhelming hope.